Today we continue in our series, The Passionate Christian Life. And we're going to talk about weathering the storms, weathering life's storms. Hi, I'm John Schol, a bishop in the United Methodist Church serving the greater New Jersey area. And as I said, today we begin to think about what does it look like to weather storms? You know, when I think about a storm, boy, I think about passionate eruptions in nature and things that just happen. I'll never forget, as a kid, we were vacationing, our whole family. We would go and visit my aunt and uncle in Georgia. And we were vacationing, and we're at this picnic, and we were by a lake, and we had the picnic tables all set up. I remember my sister Susan was very young. She was in a playpen. We were all there playing and eating and having a good time. The sun was out. And then all of a sudden, just like that, the weather changed. These dark clouds came over. All of a sudden, these winds blew up. Hail started to come down. Rain started to come down. And here are all these little kids, my mom and my dad, my aunt and my uncle, trying to all get us into safety, but get everything off the picnic tables, get my sister out of the playpen. The wind was so bad that it began to lift sand and pebbles up off. And I remember as a kid just being pelted with these things flying in my face, and then hail coming down. I'm trying to help clean up the table, and it was just a mess. We got in our cars, we started the cars up, we started to drive away, and just like that, the sun came back out and the day changed. We backed up, we unloaded, and set up for the picnic again. I don't know, storms can be like that. I don't know about you, but my life can be like that sometimes, where things just erupt all of a sudden, and it just, all of the anxiety and everything floats up to the top, and we're battling all of these different things, and then all of a sudden things just calm back down. Well, today, that's what we're going to think about. Storms. What do storms mean in our lives? What do we do with storms? The biblical passage that we heard today is about a storm. Here Jesus and the disciples are out in the boat. Now Jesus is in the back of the boat. Now you think about this. Jesus had how many disciples? 12. Okay, right. And Jesus is in the back of the boat. That makes 13. So, you know, this was a pretty good sized boat. You know, when I think about Jesus and fishing, I think about these smaller boats like rowboats. But this was a pretty good sized boat. It's probably a good 30 feet long, maybe as wide as 10 feet. So it had some size to it. It had a little bit of sturdiness to it. Now they're out on the Lake Galilee. Sometimes it's called the Sea of Galilee. When I was in the Holy Land this past January, we went and saw this lake and got to see it. And one of the things that became very clear to me is that this lake is like in a bowl. There's hills and mountains all the way around the lake. And so what I could begin to envision and realize was that this was a stormy place, that the winds would come up over the hills and down into the bowl and just stir things up. And it wasn't, unlikely for a storm just to blow over. And so I could envision what it would be like out on that lake. And we actually were out in a boat, and we had communion out there. And just as we were preparing to have communion, the winds began to shift, and it just began to get a little rocky. And I realized, oh, now I see what things were like. And probably this storm was much, much worse. And they were all very much afraid. I love how the story's told. You know, here's this storm. It talks about water lapping over the boat. And what does it talk about? Jesus sleeping in the back of the boat. You know, I mean, who could sleep through a windy storm and probably some rain and water lapping over the sides of the boat into the boat? Who could sleep through that? Well, Jesus could. But the disciples got really anxious about this storm. They were afraid for their lives. Now, they knew storms in the Lake of Galilee. They had been fishermen. They knew what was about, what these storms were like. But this one had them really stirred up. And so they wake up Jesus. And they say, Jesus, look, we're all going to perish. We're all going to die. And Jesus says, basically, ye of little faith. haven't you seen what I've done already? Don't you understand that in the midst of being with me, your life will be okay? That God will see us through. And then Jesus calms the storm. And then they remark, who is this? And the writer even talks about that the disciples were concerned, even terrified about this great miracle that happened. What does this mean? Who is this person that can calm nature? Storms in our lives, storms in the world. I mean, we've faced great storms. Sandy was an impactful storm. The Jersey Shore has faced other kinds of storms. And we know what storms are like. And also, if you're alive, you go through life storms. If you have kids, you know what storming is. If you have aging parents, you know what storming's all about. You understand these things because you've been through them. The hardships, the aches, the problems, the challenges, figuring out how you're going to pay the mortgage, figuring out where you're going to get a job, figuring out how you're going to make ends meet, figuring out how to get your kids on the right path, figuring out how you're going to care for aging parents. All of these are like storms in our lives. So let's unpack this and let's really think about how do we weather storms so that we can be passionate to live the way God wants us to live. Well, just before this story, Jesus is talking about faith. And Jesus says, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And then the story that immediately follows this is about this man who they actually chain up because he has all these demons within him. Emotionally, he's just a wreck and he's even violent. And so they chain him up because of his violent activity. They don't think he's a bad person. They just know that he's got these demons inside of him that just erupt. And the only way they can control the storms of his life is by chaining him. And Jesus heals him and unchains him, unbinds him, and sets him free. Well, isn't that what we all want? The churning that goes on in our lives, the nature and the disruption that happens, that we just want it all to calm down so that we can live our lives just as God has intended our lives to be lived. So here's the first lesson. If you think following Jesus is going to make your life a life of complete peace and comfort, you misunderstand what it means to be a follower of Jesus, what it means to be a disciple of Christ. Because it doesn't take away the storms, it helps us to move through the storms. And that's the first and most important thing, that living the life of a Christian can actually be terrifying at times because we're called to live a certain way and to give our lives in a certain way and to witness to God's love in our world. And that doesn't always bring comfort. That doesn't always bring peace. It can get the churning going. So here are several things you can do in your life when you're facing storms. First of all, you can zoom out. The biggest problem that we have sometimes when we're in the midst of a storm, whether it's an emotional storm, a spiritual storm, even a physical storm, is that we're so intense in the issue, the problem, what's going on right then, that we forget that there's much more around it. And so one of the things is to begin to zoom out and to begin to see things from a greater distance. There's this app that you can get. You can Google it, and it's called Google Earth. And it allows you just to zoom out or to zoom in. You can zoom in on somebody's home and see their home, or you can zoom all the way out and see their neighborhood, see their community, see their state, see their nation from a great distance away. And zooming out gives us this perspective that things are much bigger than what we face at this moment. And so one of the first things to do is just to zoom out when you're in the midst of a great challenge and just get a bigger view of it. Here's the second thing. Call for a lifeline. You know, there was that show and you could call if you didn't know an answer and get a lifeline. Well, you know, there are many people in your life that want to be your lifeline if you just give them a chance. If you just call them up and say, you know what, I'm going through this and I just need a listening ear. Or you know what, I'm trying to figure out what to do. Should I do this or do that? And you know, your advice could really be helpful to me right now. But just to call on a friend, a fellow church member, a family member, ask them to pray for you, but just invite them to give you some feedback and a different perspective. Because again, we get so enmeshed in what's right in front of us that zooming out and getting a broader perspective and another perspective can really be helpful. Thirdly, call for the big lifeline. Call to God. You know, pray to God. Ask God to give you clearer eyes, to give you patience, to give you understanding, to help understand why you're going through this. And fourthly, when you're talking to God, tell God exactly what you feel and what you fear. That's what the disciples said. We're all going to die. Jesus, don't you understand what's happening to us? Wake up, do something. They just let Jesus know what was going on in their minds. You know, so often we are more willing to tell our neighbor what we really think and feel rather than telling God. When you bring these things to God, God is able to help open things up like you've never experienced before. So don't be afraid to tell God exactly what you think and feel. That's what the Bible does all the time. Read the Psalms. The psalmists are always telling God. They're telling God when they're happy and rejoiceful. They're telling God when they're angry and upset and what they're feeling. That's what God invites from us. And so tell God what you're thinking and feeling. And then lastly, fifthly, what you need to do is focus on what you can do. You know, when that storm blew up and there we were vacationing beside a lake, what we did was what we could do. We couldn't stop the storm. We couldn't stop the pebbles. But what we could do is begin to pack things up, get them in the car, make sure my baby sister was okay, wrap her in blankets, get her to the car, get her safe. Those were the things we could do. We didn't get paralyzed. We didn't stand around talking, wondering what we could do. Everybody realized something had to be done, and everybody began to move into action, doing what they could do. And so that's what we need to do in the midst of life too, is just focus on what we can do. God doesn't expect you to do what you can't do. God has given you gifts to do the things you can do. So what does this look like? Zoom out. Get a bigger perspective. Call for a lifeline. Share with a friend. Get another perspective. Call upon God's lifeline. Pray to God. Share with God exactly what you think, what you're feeling. And then focus on the things that you can do. Once time in my life, as a pastor, I was visiting with a married couple. They didn't have children, but they were a wonderful, sweet couple. They were in their 60s. And she was very sick and they couldn't figure out. And she went to a series of doctors and she was getting ready to go in for a very dramatic surgery. It was touch and go. They weren't sure how it was going to go. I wasn't sure how it was going to go. I didn't want to promise them something that I didn't know how it would go. I didn't want to make a promise to them that everything was going to be okay. So as I listened to them and listened to their fears and talked with them, the only words that came to me was, God will see you through. I don't know what's going to happen, but God will see you through this. Well, she went and had the surgery. It was pretty traumatic, but she recovered. And she never fully got well, but she lived for another 6 years. And I'll never forget other times when I went to visit them. Those were the words they would repeat back to me. God will see us through. And that's the way they approached their life. that no matter what was going to happen or what did happen, God would see them through. Not too long ago, I was with Bob, and we were remembering his wife, Betsy. And I was talking about some of the challenges of my own life and some of the things I was working on. And he said to me, John, God will see you through. And boy, just made all the difference. That's the truth. In the midst of every challenge, every storm, it's God who will see us through. It's God who sees me through. If you want a passionate life, don't ignore the storms. Don't think that storms aren't going to come. Just remember to step back and get a bigger view. Call a friend. Call on God. Tell God exactly what you feel. And then focus on what you can do. And know that whatever it is, God is going to see you through. Amen.